Welcome back, everybody, to the third annual HPPA Symposium. We are welcoming for our 11 o'clock slot, Jeff Iovannone. Did I pronounce that right?
You got it.
Thank you. In his presentation, Leslie Feinberg's Buffalo, Historic Sites in Stone Butch Blues. Dr. Jeff Iovannone is a historian and historic preservation planner from Buffalo, New York, who specializes in LGBTQ heritage conservation. He holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Buffalo and will graduate this summer with a master's degree in historic preservation planning from Cornell University with a minor in LGBT studies. From 2013 to 2021, he was a faculty member in the departments of history and interdisciplinary studies at the State University of New York at Fredonia, and directed the program in women's and gender studies. Iovannone is a trailblazer in documenting upstate New York's LGBTQ history. He is the co-founder of the Gay Places Initiative, with Preservation Buffalo Niagara, a joint project that documents LGBTQ historic places in Buffalo, and has consulted for the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. In 2022, he led a successful effort to locally landmark the building that housed the nationally recognized lesbian and feminist press Firebrand Books in Ithaca, New York. Iovannone is currently a preservation planner with the Landmark Society of Western New York, based in Rochester. Welcome, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Andy, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I think we can all see that.
Looks good.
Great. So my talk is based on a digital exhibit created entitled Leslie Feinberg's Buffalo, Historic Sites in Stone Butch Blues. And I thought that this would be a great presentation for the conference because this is a very hybrid project. It combines geographic information systems through the ArcGIS StoryMaps platform with architectural history and also social history. And essentially what the exhibit does is I started with Leslie Feinberg, who is a transgender activist and writer from Buffalo, started with her semi-autobiographical novel, Stone Butch Blues, and identified and mapped out all of the actual places in Buffalo that are represented in the book that have some sort of LGBTQ historical significance. And it's the 30th anniversary of the publication of the book. It was originally published in 1993 by Firebrand Books, which was located in Ithaca, New York. And this novel is not often read through a preservation lens. It's more so seen as an autobiographical work, but it's actually incredibly spatial and place-based. So one of the things that we see is that Feinberg bases many of the book's locations, events, and characters on her own lived experiences coming of age in the bars and factories of Buffalo during the 1960s and 70s. And some of the sites in the book are referenced by their actual names, other via fictional analogs, and others more vaguely. So we get a general geographic description. And what emerges when we read this book through a preservation lens is that Stone Butch Blues provides a blueprint from which to document and interpret places where queer and transgender people worked and socialized in 1960s and 1970s Buffalo, which is a city that's largely ignored within mainstream narratives of LGBTQ history, which tend to focus on coastal geographies. Furthermore, it allows us to see known Buffalo landmarks through a queer lens And the buildings that are documented in the exhibit, both those that are extant and demolished, collectively constitute an archive of queer Buffalo. Therefore, we can read Stone Butch Blues as a map of Buffalo's queer history, and the exhibit seeks to make apparent a geography that's hidden right beneath the surface of Feinberg's text. So who was Leslie Feinberg? As I briefly mentioned, she was an internationally known lesbian and transgender writer, activist, labor organizer from Buffalo, New York. And during the 1990s, through her activism and her writing, really helps to popularize the concept of what it means to be transgender. And additionally, Stone Butch Blues was one of the first published works of transgender fiction. It was a multiple award-winning novel, and it was translated into multiple languages and has been read internationally and continues to receive a wide readership to this day. So my research question, when I was starting to work on this project, and I really started looking at the book this way when I was working with Preservation Buffalo Niagara through the Gay Places Initiative to document sites in Buffalo with LGBTQ significance. And it's probably atypical to turn to a work of fiction within our field. But if we're talking about, looking at marginalized communities and heritage, we might need to look at sources that we might not typically look at as preservation planners in order to identify places associated with a particular community. So I really started with the question of, can we actually use this book to identify and document sites in Buffalo that are associated with LGBTQ heritage? And I found out the answer was yes. I'll talk a bit more about my methodology in a minute. I think I was able to identify around 41 sites that are represented in the book. And so that led me to the argument or the thesis of the exhibit, which is that Stone Butch Blues is a spatial novel, and we can read it as a map of queer Buffalo during the 60s and 70s. And that furthermore, we can use this project as the basis for future LGBTQ heritage conservation work in Buffalo and also perhaps upstate New York more broadly. So this is what the header of the exhibit looks like on StoryMaps. And at the end of the exhibit, I'll go back to a slide that has the URL if people would like to check it out. And the methodology that I used to identify the sites was I looked at the information that and the descriptions that Feinberg actually gives us in the novel. And then I correlated that against sources like periodicals, maps, atlases, city directories, travel guides, postcards. I did some oral history interviews with LGBTQ elders from Buffalo. And then I used several different institutional repositories, particularly the Madeline Davis LGBTQ Archive of Western New York, which is at SUNY Buffalo State, the Buffalo History Museum Research Library, and the Firebrand Books records, which are part of Cornell's Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections. And I also want to point out that this project is not a standalone project, but is in conversation with a long history of place-based LGBTQ work and other travel guides and mapping projects. So for example, we might look at something like the Bob Dameron's address books and gay city guides, which started to be published beginning in 1964. So Bob Dameron was a white, upper middle class, gay businessman from San Francisco who traveled frequently for his work, and everywhere he would go to different cities, he started cataloging all the gay spaces in those cities and had the idea to start publishing address books that other gay travelers could use. And at the beginning, they're more so geared towards gay men. And then when he founds the Dameron Company to publish the guides, they start publishing guides that are focused towards lesbians as well. And as you can see from the image, they're tiny little pocket guides that are meant to be carried around with you as you travel. And many of the Dameron guides have been digitized in this GIS mapping project that's called Mapping the Gay Guides, where essentially, if you go to the site, there's a slider at the bottom of the map, and you can choose the year, and then you can see all of the sites that were represented in the Dameron guide for that particular year. And it's a really interesting and useful way to see how the number and location of LGBTQ spaces in the United States in particular changed from when the guide started being published in the 1960s up until, I think the site goes up until the 1980s or 1990s at present. And I know that the creators are also planning an expansion and are going to be adding additional data to this project. And then more recently, we could look at something like the website of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, which was founded in 2015. Their site also prominently features a GIS map that is color-coded based on different categories of properties with LGBT significance in the 5 boroughs of New York City. This was originally based on their LGBT historic context statement for New York City, and they've since expanded the number of sites on the website. I believe now there's over 400 that are represented on the map. Oops, sorry about that. So within my exhibit, I organized the sites in 2 different ways, and this is what the mapping section looks like. So first, I organized the sites by order of appearance that how they appear in the novel. So if you wanted to read the book and use the exhibit as a companion piece, you could follow along with the book and the exhibit in order. And I also make note of what is extant and which sites have been demolished. Secondly, I also group the sites into categories. So bars, clubs, and restaurants, factories and labor-related sites, etc. And one of the things that we start to see if we look at the sites by categories as opposed to order of appearance is what types of spaces still exist and which have been demolished. And one of the things that quickly became apparent through grouping the sites in this way is that all of the spaces or most of the spaces that are associated with LGBTQ or working class people, perhaps unsurprisingly, have been the sites that have been demolished, whereas other sites remain extant. And then the centerpiece of the exhibit is the GIS map, and you'll note that I've organized it so when you're zoomed out, the points gather. And then as you zoom in, they spread out. And when you click on a particular point, it will tell you the address, the historical name of the site, and then there's also a historical photograph where available. If a historical photograph wasn't available and the building was still extant, I went and took a photograph of the building as it exists today myself, which is also included in the exhibit. And then for every site represented, there is an entry that provides a narrative that gives the architectural and social history of the site, its connection to Stone Butch Blues, and then I supplement that with a variety of different archival materials, so photographs, postcards, documents, etc. And I want to quickly talk about some representative sites in the exhibit that correspond to 5 different categories. So the first is publication history. The second is bars and clubs. The third is factories. The fourth is what I'm calling queering Buffalo landmarks. So looking at known Buffalo landmarks through an LGBTQ lens. And then fifth, what my colleague Susan Ferentinos, who has done a lot of research into different property types related to LGBTQ heritage, calls sites of difficult history. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means when we get to that particular category. Okay, so let's begin with publication history. As I mentioned earlier, Stone Butch Blues was published in 1993 in Ithaca by Firebrand Books, whose headquarters was located on the second floor of the building on the Commons at 143 East State Street that some of us might be familiar with. Firebrand Books was founded in 1984 by Nancy Bariano, who was a local feminist and lesbian activist and an editor and publisher. And it becomes a multiple award-winning, nationally recognized press. And Stone Butch Blues was the press's bestseller. So by 1996, it had sold around 30,000 copies, which is a significant number of books for a small lesbian feminist press at this time. Here's a photograph of Nancy, the founder. So in talking to this particular audience, I thought it was important to mention that this book, while based in Buffalo, also has an important Ithaca connection as well. And as Andy mentioned in my bio, I wrote a successful local landmark nomination for this building that includes the history of Firebrand, and so the building was designated as a Ithaca individual local landmark by the Common Council on October 5th of 2022. Okay, so let's move on to bars and clubs. And the site I chose for this category was the Little Harlem Hotel, which was a jazz club at 496 Michigan Avenue on Buffalo's east side, which is the center of the African-American community. The Little Harlem was founded by Anne Montgomery, who is one of Buffalo's most foremost Black businesswomen. And the club originally started out as 2 separate buildings that were later remodeled that Montgomery was running as an ice cream shop and a billiard parlor. And the Little Harlem became a frequent stop on the jazz circuit between Chicago and New York City, and it was also listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book, an annual guidebook for Black road trippers that provided guidance on safe places to rest and eat during the Jim Crow era. So Buffalo was a natural stopping point for these professional jazz musicians that were moving between Chicago and New York. Unfortunately, this building, which was also a place that white gay people were frequenting. It's one of the only examples in Buffalo of a site that's really strongly correlated to LGBTQ people of color, and it was designated as a local landmark, but was destroyed in 1993 due to a grease fire, but really speaks to the fact that we need to be more proactive in Buffalo, especially about documenting resources that are connected to LGBTQ people of color before they're lost or demolished. And the Little Harlem features prominently in Feinberg's novel. There's a scene, a very poignant scene, where a Black friend of the main character, who is named Jess Goldberg, takes her to the Little Harlem Hotel, and the character starts to have realizations about how things are different for queer people of color, and how racially segregated Buffalo is at the time. And to my point about the Little Harlem being demolished, two pioneering lesbian historians from Buffalo, Liz Kennedy and Madeline Davis, documented lesbian and gay gathering places in Buffalo during the 1940s and 1950s. This is a map that they created of those spaces based on the city's 1953 zoning map. And we can see that they identified 26 different gathering places during these 2 decades, one of which was the Little Harlem. And of all these spaces that they've documented, only 2 of the buildings remain extant today. Okay, let's move along to factories. And I chose the Bethlehem Steel Company, which is located on Route 5 in Lackawanna. So Bethlehem Steel features prominently in Stone Butch Blues. In particular, Leslie Feinberg references a 1970 Supreme Court case, the United States versus the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, in which a federally appointed panel of labor experts found that Bethlehem engaged in a pattern of practice of racial discrimination in their employment practices at the Lackawanna plant. So as a result, the company agreed to set hiring, promotion, and training quotas for African Americans. And around this time, they also established a similar hiring quota for women, which is depicted in Stone Butch Blues. And one of the things that we see is originally the characters, who are, for the most part, working class lesbians, are jumping at the opportunity to work at the steel plant, to have a union job. But then they realize that it's not worth it, because management is going to make things difficult for them until they essentially quit, but at the same time could say that they technically fulfilled their quota, but that the women that they hired chose to quit. And this is also significant because, and here's a view of the administration building. So if we look at the layout of Bethlehem, there was the works, and then set off to the side was the Beaux-Arts style administration building. That when we're typically looking at labor history in Buffalo and factories, we're not necessarily thinking about that through the lens of LGBTQ history, and that these were places where working class LGBTQ people had connections to, that we see can powerfully if we look at the way that the Bethlehem Supreme Court case is represented within Feinberg's novel. Okay, moving on to creating Buffalo landmarks. And I think I chose 2 buildings for this. The first of which is the Brisbane building, which is designed by architects Milton E. Beebe and Son in 1894 as a mixed commercial and professional space that's at the intersection of Main, Clinton, and Washington streets, overlooking Lafayette Square in downtown Buffalo. And from 1894 to 1992, the Brisbane building was also the home of the Kleinhans Company, which was a premier men's clothing store for middle to upper income earners. And the store is represented directly by name in Stone Butch Blues. Leslie Feinberg tells us that this is the place where butch lesbians who had a more masculine public presentation and gender expression were going to buy their clothes when they were going out to the bars and the clubs, and they wanted to look really stylish on a night out. And they were willing to risk some harassment or some discrimination while shopping so that they could have clothes that fit who they felt they were and how they wanted to represent themselves. Of course, when we look at the history of Kleinhans, we see it as just being that premier men's clothing store. We don't necessarily think about the LGBTQ connection. Excuse me while I have a sip of water. I'm just gonna mute myself. Okay. And of course, we also know the Kleinhans name in Buffalo through Kleinhans Music Hall, which is a national historic landmark that was financed in part by the Kleinhans family, located at Symphony Circle, which is part of the Olmsted and Vox Parks and Parkways system. And then the second Buffalo landmark I chose was a location of the Deco restaurant, which is a chain of Buffalo coffee shops that started in the 1940s and 50s. And this particular location of Deco, if you look at the right-hand side of the photograph, you could see the side of the building on Main Street with the Deco sign is represented in Stone Butch Blues. One of the things that we see with the gay bar scene in Buffalo is that people would go out to the bars first, and then they would continue their evening out at 24-hour coffee shops. And this Deco was a particularly popular location for the gay community during the 1960s and 1970s. And this was a really fun site to research because it's represented in the book. And here's an advertisement for Deco from 1932. So it's represented in the book. It's also listed in the Bob Dameron's address books that I mentioned as a gay gathering place. And then also people mentioned it in some of the oral histories that I conducted as a place where people were going in the 1960s and 70s. So here was a popular Buffalo institution during the 1940s and 1950s. There's almost a Deco on every corner in downtown Buffalo, but the location at 273 Main Street has a particular LGBTQ connection that is not often recognized when we're looking at the history and significance of Deco in Buffalo. And then here's another view of the building from 1984. So you can see the Burnstone cigar store, and then the Deco was located where the New Trend restaurant was located in this photograph. And unfortunately, the building has since been demolished. Okay. Moving along to sites of difficult history. And I'm going to read a quote from Gail Dubrow, who's a social historian of the built environment, from her essay, Taking Action, an Overview of LGBTQ Historic Preservation Initiatives, where she explains, I think in a really succinct way, what we're talking about when we're talking about sites that have a difficult history in relation to the history of the LGBTQ community. So she tells us that there is a need to move beyond marking places associated with LGBTQ history per se to identify places that have been essential to producing and policing heteronormativity, or gender and sexuality norms, in other words. Marking gay bars that were sites of rebellion is a powerful act. However, as a matter of social justice, police stations and liquor licensing offices that once led the charge in harassing LGBTQ people are also critical sites for telling the story. Similarly, historic places such as psychiatric hospitals, where queer people were incarcerated and quote unquote treated under the mistaken medical belief that they possessed disorders, should address the dark and difficult aspects of their history as part of site interpretation. It's necessary, but far from sufficient, to mark this history at the few sites LGBTQ people historically claimed. And we see what Dubrow is talking about, represented in Feinberg's novel, through the Richardson Olmsted complex, which was historically known as the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane, and later the Buffalo State Hospital. I think many of us are probably familiar with this building, completed in 1880, designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, and has really been celebrated as an example of adaptive reuse of a historic building. Today, it's a boutique hotel and conference center in the main buildings of the complex, and then the other buildings remain under development. And this building appears 2 times in Stone Butch Blues. So first, the main character is institutionalized by her parents for being gender nonconforming. And later in the novel, when she's an adult and has moved to New York City, but is coming back to Buffalo to visit, she's looking for the woman that was her mentor when she was coming out in the community in the 1960s, and finds out that she has been institutionalized, and goes to this building to visit her, and specifically, references the Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. And so here is another example, and this site of difficult history also relates to the category of queering Buffalo landmarks, where we don't often think about or interpret the history of this complex through the lens or the perspective of the fact that people who were queer or gender nonconforming may have also been institutionalized, right? And how do we adaptively reuse the building while also recognizing some of the painful history that is attached to it, specifically through an LGBTQ context? And here's just a plan of the asylum. We could see it's a Kirkbride style asylum, and we could see it's a massive V-shaped complex of buildings. And Feinberg specifically references in the book that center administration building with the 2 square towers that you saw in the previous photograph. Okay, so some concluding thoughts that I have, and this is a photograph of Leslie Feinberg's name, which is imprinted in the sidewalk alongside other notable writers from Buffalo outside the main entrance of the downtown branch of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, which is at 1 Lafayette Square. So as I mentioned earlier, we can see through documenting the historic sites that are represented in Feinberg's book that it's mostly the sites that are related to LGBTQ and working class people that have been demolished. So that gives us a guiding principle to think about as preservationists going forward, doing work in cities like Buffalo or in upstate New York in terms of the preservation of heritage that's related to marginalized communities. And also the fact that I was able to identify 41 sites that are represented in the book, all in Buffalo, with the exception of the Firebrand building, which is in Ithaca, shows that there's a lot more work that we need to do in terms of identifying sites with LGBTQ significance in underrepresented geographies. Yes, upstate New York, but also beyond. And that Feinberg's book and this project can serve as one guiding example for doing that work as preservation planners. So I will go back to the graphic for the exhibit. If people check it out, I would love to hear your thoughts. And there's a lot of, in my opinion, interesting archival materials to look at within the exhibit. I spent quite a significant amount of time constructing this. So the URL is tinyurl.com / Leslie Feinbergs with no apostrophe Buffalo. So I will conclude there, and I would be happy to answer questions that anyone has.
Thanks, Jeff. Does anybody have any questions for Jeff? I don't see any in our Q&A at the moment. I have just a basic one, Jeff.
Yes.
It's a little bit of a leading question, but I'm just really interested in how using GIS to map out the historic sites that you found in the source material. How does that help your or our or anybody's understanding, or how does it how can it help to underscore the way we perceive this history, or any history for that matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the reasons why I didn't want to just identify the sites in the book and have something like a chart to actually map it out is because then we start to see relationships between the sites and how the locations change over time. And of course, I have my perception and my interpretation, but then other viewers of the exhibit might see different patterns or different relationships that I don't see. So, right, I mentioned which categories of sites are still extant, which are demolished. We can also see, if we're looking from 1940s through 1970s, the way that the spaces shift to different parts of the city. So, right, why is that occurring? Right, why are gay people gathering right in one neighborhood or area of the city during one particular decade, and then why is it moving to a different area of the city during a different decade? And it also starts to show us the relationship between the built environment and the LGBTQ community, and vice versa, and how when we're thinking about LGBTQ communities, they're inflected by the particular geographies that they exist in, so that the city is shaping what the community looks like and the community formation and how people are responding to their location and to their conditions and to oppression within that geographic space, but then also in turn, how LGBTQ people in this context are shaping the history of Buffalo as a city.
Michael has a question.
Great presentation, Jeff, and very much enjoyed it. Drawing on my Buffalo history, my own personal history, having gotten my very first suit at Klein Hands.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stopped in at the Deco restaurant, and so on and so forth. Is there in the book or any of the other sources you had with respect to two things strike me? References of the Albright Knox Art Gallery and the associated activities with the Albright Knox, the galleries that are associated, and particularly those in Allentown. And the other thing that struck me, is there any reference to the jewelry stores? Because both are networks of some sort. And I remember the jewelry store scenario because my father worked in the jewelry store in downtown Buffalo in that district. To then other connections. I just wanted to mine your institutional history of the Buffalo references in that respect.
Yeah, so with the Albright Knox, I didn't include it in the exhibit because it's not directly referenced, but there is a connection. So one of the things that we see that happens in the book is the main character starts out in the 1960s identifying as a butch lesbian, but then as Buffalo is deindustrializing and it's more difficult to get a good factory job, starts passing and living publicly as a man because it's easier to find employment. And the character is essentially going to a temp agency and doing a variety of different temp jobs. And one of the things that I found in the course of my research was that Leslie Feinberg actually did that's based on her real experience. And one of the jobs that she had that she got through the temp agency was working as a security guard at the Albright Knox art gallery. In relation to the jewelry stores, that is also not directly referenced in the book, but I did find, in particular, going through issues of the local gay newspaper, which is called The Fifth Freedom, that there was a jewelry store in Allentown that was called Orem that had a large gay clientele.
Thank you. That confirms my personal experience. We should do another expanded version of the exhibit.
Okay.
Well, now that you moved to Rochester, the other thing that strikes me that's parallel to what it is that you mentioned in the Deco coffee shops. The coffee shops and the Your Host coffee shops, which were the successors in the suburbs in Western New York, in particular the Buffalo area, Amherst, and so on and so forth. And the coffee shops in Rochester, and I would include in the coffee shops the downtown White Castle, still there. If you look carefully at the history of the White Castle, and the reason I know this, because I've always been a night owl, right? And I would go to these 24-hour locations as a student, right? Because they were the only thing open. And you had a broader cross-section of what the activities in the city were all about than if you were to go to them at noon, at lunch hour, with office workers who had come in from the suburbs and so on and so forth. I just share that with you as my own personal observations of those cities. Thank you.
Any other questions? Kristen?
It's not so much a question, but just, a recognition that Jack, what you've done really underscores the need for practitioners to engage with more thoughtful, deep research and drilling down and finding places, because so much of what we do, and it's baked into all, to the infrastructure of communication that we start with the reconnaissance level survey, and it's so heavily focused on integrity and foreign architecture that it's also very difficult and time consuming to do the kind of research that we've done to do all of this survey and actually find places. So thank you for bringing that to light, and also if anything else that you want to speak to in that regard.
Couldn't entirely hear everything Kristen was saying, but if I understood correctly, I think based on her points, one of the other things that we see here through this project is a lot of the places or the districts that are represented in the book are designated either locally or on the National Register, but for architecture, and there's a lot of opportunity to amend those nominations and add in some of the social history that we see represented in Feinberg's book. And I think there's certainly a lot of examples of that more broadly if we're thinking about the history of other underrepresented communities.
So speaking of patterns, have you identified patterns based on what you've mapped out? For like, there's a certain path that people may have taken during the weekend or on a Saturday night or something like that.
Well, the path that I have mapped out is if we look or if we think back to the map that I showed that Kennedy and Davis created of the gathering spaces in the 1940s and 1950s, those spaces are all in the downtown area east of Niagara Square. And then what happens, that area of the city is singled out in the city's urban renewal plans. And then we also see the effects of the rise of policing and how it impacts the community during the 1950s and 1960s, in particular after Nelson Rockefeller is elected governor of New York State, and he institutes a campaign to really clean up corruption statewide within the state liquor authority. So we see then those spaces closing and the spaces and where the community is gathering moving northward into the Allentown neighborhood in the 1970s for a couple different reasons. So the Allentown neighborhood is historically associated with the arts, is seen as the bohemian community of Buffalo, so it was a natural fit that that's a place where gay people would go. But then also by that time, we see the reemergence of those spaces in a different area of the city, because then there's a civil rights organization, formal civil gay and lesbian rights organization in Buffalo that has the ability to fight police persecution. And that is very much in line with national trends where we see these organizations emerging in communities throughout the United States as gay activism gets more militant in the mid to late 1960s. And then after the Stonewall uprising of 1969 and the shift to a more nationwide radical movement for gay liberation.
Emily, go ahead.
Are you finished?
I'm done, thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff, for that. It was really great. One thing you just mentioned, I happen to have a good contact at the ArcGIS company that are always looking for more examples to put on their gallery page.
Oh.
So perhaps I could shoot over your URL to them and maybe they would put it on their gallery if that's something you'd be interested in.
I would love that. Thank you for offering.
Cool, yeah. And then also, yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and about Ithaca Landmarks Preservation Commission, but could you speak a little bit about Buffalo's Landmarks Commission and how, if there is one, and how these sites are thought about by them or not, as the case may be?
Yeah, in terms of the Buffalo Commission, there is nothing locally designated in Buffalo specifically for LGBTQ significance. So there's a lot of work to be done there. The local firebrand building nomination was actually the first property in upstate New York, whether we're talking local, statewide, National Register to be designated for LGBTQ significance. And then the second occurred just recently. Todd Union on the University of Rochester River campus was added to or listed on the National Register on May 8th for its connection as the founding place of the Rochester Gay Liberation Front. And that nomination came out of my current organization. So there's a lot of work to be done in upstate New York, right? Just as one example, which hasn't received the same attention in terms of identifying LGBTQ spaces in comparison to something like New York City, which has the majority of National Register nominations for some sort of LGBTQ connection.
Okay, well, I want to thank you once again, Dr. Jeff, for your presentation. And we're going to give you a round of applause. And for anybody online, we are going to stop the recording, but I think I'll leave this open if anybody wants to chat with us during lunch. We will return to our sessions at 2 p.m. and we will see you then.